The Conservative MP Daniel Kawczynski, a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Saudi Arabia. Mr Kawczynski, last night the chairman of the committee upon which you sit, the Foreign Affairs Committee upon which you sit, called for some form of investigation. Crispin Blunt. We've now heard a senior member of Saudi military also call for an investigation into the possible commission of war crimes. And yet with Saudi Arabia it often seems as if a different set of rules is being followed. Do you think any investigation will unfold, will occur?
Well, first of all, let me correct you. I'm not the chairman of the all-party group for Saudi Arabia. That's a Labour MP called Yasmin Qureshi. But I'm extremely concerned at the very one-sided, biased reporting of Newsnight of this extremely complicated war. And it seems that Newsnight and the BBC are determined to ignore the atrocities that the Houthi tribes have implemented in Yemen, the terrible brutality with which they have seized that country, the firing of mortars into Saudi Arabia itself from Yemen.
Let me help you. We're not in Saudi Arabia. Politicians don't get to determine what journalists are and are not allowed to do. Our investigation was conducted into the very simple question of whether weapons sold by British companies to Saudi Arabia had possibly been deployed in the commission of war crimes and the breach of international law. I think most people understood that, but I'm happy to clarify it for you. So I'll return, if I may, to the question that I asked you originally. Do you have much hope that a proper investigation will be launched into what has been happening in Yemen and what our films have displayed? The BBC, for the record, have also been in Aden and have also reported upon Houthi atrocities.
Well, I fundamentally dispute your coverage of the entire situation in Yemen, and you and Newsnight are trying to peddle a completely false prospectus to the British people of the situation on the ground.
Are we going to get close to appalling? Are we going to get close to answering the question I've asked about an investigation, Daniel Kawczynski?
This is a coalition. You keep referring to Saudi Arabia. This is a coalition of Gulf states. More than 10 countries are involved.
Yes, that's why we say a Saudi-led coalition. It includes Qatar, it includes Bahrain, it includes Egypt, it may include countries from Sudan. I would like you to begin. I'd like you to begin answering the question I've asked, which is: do you feel an investigation will ever happen?
Interrupting every time I want to answer the question.
Right. Here's the question for the final time: do you think there will be a proper international investigation into the possible commission of war crimes by Saudi Arabia? You can take all the time in the world to answer that question, sir.
The war crimes are being perpetrated by the Houthi tribes, not by Saudi Arabia.
That bottling plant that you just saw footage of there had been bombed by airstrikes. Well,
you keep referring. You've sent a reporter.
We've moved away again from the question. Do you think there will be an investigation?
You know, you have an agenda at Newsnight, and you don't want anybody to dispute
Tell me what the agenda is.
The way in which you are covering this war.
What's the agenda?
You have an agenda against the Gulf States coalition. And you want to peddle a myth that only one side is responsible for atrocities.
No, we've just acknowledged that the Houthis are also responsible for atrocities. We've just listed other members of the coalition.
So why haven't you shown any coverage of the massacres
the investigation is into whether or not weapons sold by British companies have been used in the commission of war crimes possibly committed by Saudi Arabia. The Houthis are not our allies.
Are acting in a completely disgraceful way.
Remarkable encounter.
Over the coverage of this war. Absolutely disgraceful.
I feel guilty for keeping you from your home this evening. The Houthis are not our allies and they're not our customers. Therefore, the public interest of British journalism is not served at this point by investigating what they have or have not been doing. We sell weapons to...
You are deliberately giving a very biased, one-sided opinion of this appalling, complicated war in Yemen, which 10 countries are acting upon. They are doing everything possible to limit civilian casualties, and yet you are trying to deliberately mislead the British people, and you are trying to cast some sort of aspersion on the United Kingdom.
Okay, and so are the United Nations.
Defence capability to Saudi Arabia.
So are the United Nations, so are Médecins Sans Frontières, so are most of the human rights organisations and aid charities on the ground in that country. We're all pursuing a single-minded, biased agenda against Saudi Arabia and their coalition partners.
Newsnight's agenda is very different. I've been watching most of the day-to-day coverage from all sorts of news channels from around the world, and particularly from Al Jazeera and from Arab channels.
Yes.
And I can tell you that the coverage that they are giving of this war is very, very different to that of the BBC.
Well, that is what one would expect, perhaps, from a television station in part funded by one of the coalition partners. I will, more in hope than expectation, try one more time. Is there any chance of Saudi Arabia being exposed to the sort of scrutiny that almost every other country on the planet could expect if it was accused of what Saudi Arabia stands accused of tonight?
And I will answer for the upteenth time. The coalition forces of 10 countries are doing everything possible to limit civilian casualties, and the Newsnight are deliberately trying to falsify the situation on the ground in Yemen.
How?
Through your biased coverage.
No, how are we trying to falsify the situation on the ground? Are you suggesting the footage was doctored? Are you suggesting something has been made up? Or are we missing something here?
Well,
perhaps Al Jazeera have had some wonderful scoop that we've missed.
You've sent somebody. Well, you're not answering me. You're not allowing me to answer again.
You haven't even started to answer my first question.
You've sent a report. You've sent a reporter out there at the license fee expense who keeps referring to a bottling plant in the middle of a desert. And you say that you show all these plastic bottles full of water, and you say you found no evidence that it was used as a training centre. Well, of course you wouldn't find any evidence. Any evidence of nefarious purposes would have been disposed of or taken away before the BBC journalist turns up. It's an extremely biased reporting. And what I would say to your listeners is that they ought to look at the UN Security Council resolution on this and listen to coverage from around the world.
Okay, let's try another tack.
The BBC are anti-Saudi,
yes,
but this
we've established
deliberate and provocative distortion of the fact is wrong, because you are misleading the British people, and it's time that people stood up to the appalling bias of the BBC and the distortion and the untruths.
Absolutely,
that you are
hidden agendas, all of this. Surely in those circumstances the case for a full and frank...
You wouldn't ever accept that, because the BBC is omnipotent and such an important organisation, never makes any mistakes, and it is supreme. Of course, that's right, yes.
And perhaps, if that were even close to the case, there would be an even more compelling case for an investigation. I think we stopped going round in circles hours ago. Daniel Kawczynski, many thanks indeed for your time.